Okay, well, good morning and hello, everyone. On behalf of the State Historic Preservation Office, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the 40th Annual Preserve Minnesota Conference. I hope everyone is safe and well. I'm Michael Koop, Certified Local Government Coordinator and Conference Organizer with the State Historic Preservation Office, and I'm speaking to you from my home in St. Paul, Minnesota, the homeland of the Dakota people. I invite you all to let us know where you're participating from and welcome you to acknowledge tribal communities, as Minnesota is within the traditional homeland of the Anishinaabe. You can do that by typing in the chat feature by clicking on the chat icon that looks like a small circle with a little bump in the bottom left, and then entering your comment. There is at least 13,000 years of American Indian history in Minnesota. Other Native nations with ancestral connections here include the Iowa, Ho-Chunk, Cheyenne, Cree, Lakota, and Assiniboine. We'd also love to hear if this is your first time joining a Preserve Minnesota conference, so feel free to type that into the chat feature as well if you're a first-time attendee. Now, if you were with us last year in St. Cloud, you may have filled out an online survey regarding the updating of Minnesota's preservation plan, or perhaps you voted for a preservation mascot. For this year's conference, we were going to conclude a year of engagement and forward the draft plan to the National Park Service for final approval. However, our timeline has been modified, and we have received a year-long extension for that initiative. There are still ways, however, to engage with this process, and a draft plan will be out for public comment in mid-2021. You can still sign up for SHPO's Gov Delivery messaging for this by visiting our webpage to subscribe, and we encourage you to do that. We've all been adjusting to the global pandemic, and our virtual conference reflects those adjustments. While the SHPO team greatly values the networking opportunities we have during our in-person events, we hope that our online series will allow for greater access and participation for the 6 sessions scheduled over the next 3 weeks. Thank you for being a part of the virtual conference and joining us from your home or wherever you're tuning in. We know that computer screens with virtual presentations are no substitute for meeting face-to-face. So we really appreciate you taking the time to join us. With that, I want to welcome our speakers for this morning's session. Raina Regan is the Director of the Easement Program with the National Trust for Historic Preservation in Washington, D.C., and Ethan Boot is the Real Estate Manager with Rethos Places Reimagined. So I'm going to turn it over to Raina.
Thank you, Michael. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so we can get started. Great. I hope all of you, Michael or John, can you confirm that everyone can see my screen, hopefully?
Yes.
Great. Thank you. Well, good morning, everyone from Washington, D.C., where I am joining you from my home. And thank you, Michael, for that excellent introduction. As Michael said, I am Raina Regan, the Director of the Easement Program at the National Trust, and I'm here to present Protecting Historic Places in Perpetuity, an overview of preservation easements, where I'll be joined later by Ethan Boot, who's going to give an overview of the Minnesota preservation easement use and as it relates to the program that he works with at Rethos. So just for those tuning in today, just so you understand what we hope to cover in this session, I'm going to give the broad view of an overview of preservation conservation easements. If you've never used them before, or unfamiliar with them, or only have a basic understanding of what this legal tool is. We'll go into a little bit more deeper about the framework and the legal mechanism of the easement agreement as a legal document. I'm going to give a brief overview on how organizations operate an easement program for both organizations that might be curious about starting to hold easements for the first time, or those that may haven't or have held them in the past. And lastly, I'll turn it over to Ethan, who'll talk a little bit more about Rethos's program. So to begin, an overview of preservation and conservation easements. So what is a preservation and conservation easement? At the very, definition level, it's a legal agreement between a property owner or a landowner and a nonprofit organization or a government agency with the purpose to protect and preserve the significant either historic, preservation, conservation, or other types of significant resources that are found on that piece of property. You might be familiar with the concept of easements as they're a legal tool used to help with our property rights in the United States. And as I like to explain, if you own real property in the US, it's like you have a bundle of sticks. And when you give an easement to another organization or government entity, whether that's for preservation or conservation, whether that's a utility easement, whether that's an access easement, you're giving one of those sticks to another entity so they have some rights to your property, but that's what we like to call a non-possessory interest. So they don't have the rights to ownership or other rights that typically come with owning real estate in the United States. This legal tool can be used to protect a wide range of resources. These are just some examples of the types of resources that we protect with easements at the National Trust. Everything ranging from forestry lands, agricultural open space, to historic resources dating from the 1700s to the 1960s. There are a lot of ways to identify what is significant about a property, and those can be just the historic resources, which is what many of us are most familiar with, and those could be resources that are eligible or listed on the National Register, but it also could be other elements of the property as well. A property may have significant forestry resources that should be protected and preserved through a conservation easement. You can regulate subdivision to prevent further development on a property. You can require agricultural uses, conform with sound agricultural practices. So there's a lot of different ways that easements can be used to protect significant resources. A lot of people ask, well, why should I use this legal tool? There are a lot of benefits to using this private legal agreement. One of the biggest ones is, the property owner has continued ownership and use of the property, but they can sell it or they can pass it on to heirs and know that those significant resources will be preserved in perpetuity. For a preservation organization, it can be a smaller investment than, say, owning and operating a piece of real estate, and they can ensure that a resource is protected in perpetuity in that way. There are some risks that come with preservation easements, particularly for a preservation organization that holds them. They are liabilities for an organization, and there is ongoing administration of the easement, which I'll talk about. That is a requirement for the organization. And you have to be prepared to enforce the easement or take legal action if necessary. So at a big picture level, just like you may be familiar with local preservation ordinances, that there's a state enabling law that outlines how those can be created in a municipality. Conservation and preservation easements have the same similar state enabling laws that govern how preservation and conservation easements can be created in the jurisdiction where they are being created. So in Minnesota, you all have adopted the Uniform Conservation Easement Act, which is an act that has been adopted by about half the states in the United States that kind of gives a very, very broad framework on how preservation and conservation easements can be established. Other states have very specific statutes. And so it kind of depends if you're working in the easement space, if you go to a different state, sometimes you have to learn these nuances. A lot of people will ask me and others, well, what is the difference between why should I use a preservation easement versus protecting my property through a local preservation ordinance? And this is a great question. And I'm not going to go through all of these. And in some cases, the property may be located in an area where there's not a local preservation ordinance, and so the easement is the only legal tool available to the property owner. But in other jurisdictions, you may have both available. And at the National Trust, we have many of our properties that are protected both with a preservation easement and a local and through a local ordinance. And one of the big features of preservation easements is we like to say it's a private agreement. It's between the property owner and the organization. There's normally no public process for project review. Demolition is normally outright prohibited with an easement versus a local ordinance. Typically, there are some economic hardship provisions that can kind of prevent or can kind of allow demolition in certain situations. And easements can be a more flexible tool for the specific property and typically have an affirmative maintenance obligation, where in some jurisdictions, maintenance may not be as affirmatively enforced. And there's many other, I'm not going to go through all of them, but those are some of the big ones that I like to highlight. I'd quickly like to mention that there are federal tax benefits available for conservation easement donations, what is called a qualified conservation contribution. It's in the IRS code 170H. And that is a specific type of easement donation where you are donating significant restrictions that protect significant preservation or conservation values on the property. They must be perpetual and they must be to a qualified organization. Not to, this type of transaction has very specific regulations. And so if it's something that you're interested in pursuing, we always recommend that you should seek the advice of an attorney or a tax advisor or professionals that have experience with these types of transactions. At a very basic level, the tax deduction itself is based upon the value of the property before the easement, and then the value of the property after the easement is placed on the property. And that difference in value based on those restrictions is the federal tax deduction available to property owners. So how do organizations acquire new preservation easements, or how are they created? And typically new preservation easements are established. These are the four common ways, at least in the United States. A nonprofit organization might own real estate and decide that they no longer want to, or they are gifted real estate and then they sell that and place a preservation easement or covenant on the time at the sale. It may be donated by a property owner, both for the tax benefit I mentioned, or it may just be, a family property that they want to sell, but they want to make sure it's preserved to ensure their legacy. Sometimes these are conditions of grants, typically for state or local governments, and in federal in some situations. Or if it's government real estate that's being disposed of, they typically will protect the property with some type of covenant or easement. This is required in the Section 106 process for a no adverse effects determination, for those of you familiar with that process. So I'm going to take a very basic review of what's involved in a preservation and conservation easement agreement, the legal terms, and then Ethan is actually going to go into a little bit more detail. So if I go through this quickly, don't worry, you're going to get it again with Ethan. So he'll talk you through it a little bit more specifically. These are the common preservation covenants that we at the National Trust and most preservation organizations place in their easement legal agreement. There's what we call an affirmative maintenance obligation, which requires the property owner to maintain the property in a good or better condition at the time that the easement was established. This is often the most common trouble spot with easement administration. If you have a property owner who's not maintaining their property, and so that may require some easement enforcement if it becomes to a point that the property's integrity is being compromised. There's something called prohibited activities, which are absolutely prohibited. Demolition is normally one of them. Some division can sometimes be included, and that means that no matter what happens, the preservation organization does not have the discretion to approve that activity, and the owner cannot conduct that activity on the property. There's something that are called conditional rights, which means that the easement holding organization must approve those activities before the property owner conducts them. And these are things like alterations to the exterior, building new buildings, things of that nature. But there are also reserve rights that the property owner gets to retain. And those are things such as being able to do ongoing regular cyclical maintenance. There are other very common easement restrictions. I just listed a couple of them here. If you are doing a tax motivated easement, you typically have to have some type of public access. Since you're getting a public benefit, there has to be some type of public access to the property. This is sometimes like 2 days a year. It's a very minimal. You're not opening your house for regular tours. There are commonly included things to deal with casualty damage and insurance if there's a major casualty event at the property. but also remedies if an owner is not following the easement, how the preservation organization can enforce the easement, and also amendments and extinguishment if the easement ever has to be altered or changed and re-recorded or partially or fully extinguished through a court order, and that's normally included in the easement agreement. So just briefly, I wanted to mention before I get into the next section a little bit about our program at the National Trust. Our program at the National Trust easement program has been around since 1973, and our most recent easement dates from just March of this year. We protect and preserve a wide range of properties in 25 states plus DC, but none in Minnesota. We protect all kinds of properties from urban to rural locations, residential properties, private clubs, historic house museums, and former National Trust real estate and commercial properties. We have a lot of easements adjacent to National Trust historic sites to protect the viewshed and the character of those places. And my role at the National Trust to ensure the ongoing stewardship, monitoring, and enforcement of our existing easement portfolio of our existing easements, but also helping to develop new easements. And I should add, the majority of our easements at the National Trust originate through what is called our Gifts of Real Estate program, where individuals, typically through a bequest, gift us real estate as part of our philanthropy efforts, and we sell those real estate with an easement if it's historic at the time of sale. So operating an easement program at a very big picture level, to be an organization that wants to hold easements, accept easements, place easements on properties, you typically have to be a qualified organization. This is normally a nonprofit 501c3 or a governmental entity. You must have a commitment to protect and enforce those restrictions, and that's normally considered the financial resources so that you are able to enforce those restrictions if needed. But at the very beginning of thinking about starting an easement program, it's important to think about how would an easement program or how would holding easement fit within your organization's mission? What are the goals of starting an easement program? So these could be short-term goals. There might be a really significant property that you want to ensure is preserved in perpetuity and there's no one else available to do it. And so that's a short-term goal. Long-term might be, we want to ensure the viewshed protection of our entire town. There's a town in Virginia where we hold about a dozen easements that the neighbors and the community made a concerted effort to donate easements on a significant part of the land over a significant period of time to ensure the viewshed, and there was a lot of development pressure. So that was a long-term goal. And so that may be something that your organization might be wanting to ensure. But also being able to establish the financial and other resources to enforce and monitor those easements over time is really important to ask at the beginning of the process. So some people ask, well, how do you fund an easement program, or how do you have the resources, as I keep mentioning? And so this normally is done through the acceptance of new easements. So when a new easement is established, and this is typically the three different ways, typically nonprofit organizations establish what we like to call an easement endowment, or sometimes called a fair share contribution, or there's several different names for it you might have heard, but essentially this is normally a cash contribution to an endowment or another legal reserve that an organization will have in order to make sure they can take legal action if necessary, but also have the staff time and resources to do those ongoing monitoring visits. I'm not going to go into these in more detail. Happy to talk through them at the end if there's questions, but these are commonly different ways that organizations use to calculate how much money they need in order to enforce and monitor that specific easement. So acquiring new easements, when an organization is developing or establishing a new easement, part of the long-term success or preservation of that property occurs when you're developing that new agreement. And that's partially, going through a process to evaluate each property and identifying what are the significant features of that property, whether those are preservation features or conservation features, and determining what should be protected and how it should be protecting. how it should be protected. This is something that we take, very seriously, and I know other organizations do, because you want to restrict the property appropriately, but not be over limiting the future use of the property. Use restrictions are one area where we see a lot of long-term problems with the preservation of resources if the use restrictions are too restrictive on a property, and it becomes difficult to have the property be used in a way that's sustainable. So quickly, from start to finish, if you're considering donating an easement to an organization, or an organization is going to establish, this is kind of the start to finish process that's involved. Considering you're going to evaluate the property, you're going to do some initial due diligence. Does this property make sense for our organization to accept an easement? You normally want to be consulting with some type of an attorney, either inside your organization or outside counsel, to ensure that the transaction is done following all the state enabling law and other legal requirements in Minnesota. There'll be some easement drafting, so identifying those restrictions, and then something called baseline documentation, which is actually documenting the property at the time of the easement to have that baseline understanding of what is the condition, what is being protected. Typically, organizations will do some type of title investigation to see if there's any other liens or mortgages that might need to be subordinated to the easement. And that involves actually reaching out to the bank and asking for them to subordinate their interests. So basically allowing the easement to be in first position on the title, as we may call it, to ensure that if the mortgage were ever be foreclosed on, the easement would still be retained on the property. And that's a requirement of that federal tax deduction I mentioned, to make sure the easement would be in perpetuity. Because if a mortgage is foreclosed and the easement is below it on the title, the easement would be extinguished. And those two last items, the acknowledgement and the IRS Form 8283, are part of the process if you're doing a tax motivated easement, which I mentioned. And then just kind of stewardship on once the easement's established. This is kind of the ongoing maintenance of the easement, as I like to call it. Establishing relationship with the property owner, monitoring regularly, reviewing those requests, having the staff funding and the staff established that can maintain those relationships. And this is important to ensure there's no long-term easement enforcement, is having good relationships with the property owners, and they know your organization, what the easement is, what they need to do to reach out if needed. And then lastly, I just like to touch on this, if there becomes a situation where a property owner is violating the terms of the easement, this can be, someone has built, the extreme examples are someone's built something that's not permitted. But the more typical examples is there's, significant deferred maintenance. We at the National Trust try to work with the property owner to kind of figure out a path forward without legal action. But if necessary, we go all the way through to seeking legal action to get these violations remedied if necessary, to ensure the terms of the easement are upheld. And I'll just add a couple of resources if you're interested in learning more. At the National Trust, on our Preservation Leadership Forum, we have a whole page dedicated to easements. There's a book called Starting and Operating an Easement Program that's free to download that I highly recommend. We have other articles on easement stewardship in the time of coronavirus and other frequently asked questions. So I highly recommend that. And the Land Trust Alliance is the national organization for land trusts that do a lot of conservation easement work, and they have a lot of best practices. Or you can just email me if you have questions. And with that, I will turn it over to Ethan.
All right, I can start sharing my screen here.
I think, oh, there it goes.
All right, so thank you, Raina. I'm Ethan Booty. I'm the real estate manager at Rethos Places Reimagined. And I'm going to be continuing on talking about our easement program, and I'm going into a little bit more detail about our easements to follow up on Raina's overall 1,000-foot view. So the presentation outline, so how I'm going to talk about this, first I'm just going to give you a little introduction to our organization, I'm going to go over our program policies, and I'm also going to go through an easement example just to show some language, some of our base sample easements. And then I'm going to talk through some of our monitoring procedures and then a few case studies of our easements around the state. So about Rethos, we are a statewide preservation organization. You may know us from our previous name, the Preservation Alliance of Minnesota, but we changed our name last year to more accurately account for our programming. We believe that the ethos of a community is at the core of our programs, and then we have a little play on words with the re part, with all the re words that we do: rehab, restore, reconnect, reinvest. The list goes on. But we have 4 main program areas. The first being rural programs. We run the Minnesota Main Street program, as well as some other programming that my colleagues Serena and Emily will be presenting on next week. And then we have an education program for DIYers and craftspeople for how they can rehab their own homes, as well as history classes and other classes that connect people with historic places. We have a policy program where we advocate for important policy around the state that impacts our stakeholders, particularly the Minnesota Historic Tax Credit. And then finally, my program, the real estate program. The main focus of this is our investment partnerships for state historic tax credit rehabs, but this also includes the subject of this presentation, our easements. So we hold 8 easements currently around the state, with a 9th underway. We will be closing on that hopefully soon this fall. But as you can see, that they very much vary in location, size, type of building, and then what you can't see necessarily is what the scale of each easement actually covers within all of these buildings. So they're fairly diverse collection. We've also gathered them over the past 30 years or so, since the beginning of our organization in the early 80s. And we've acquired them every so often, as you can see some of the dates there on the left. Yeah, we have a couple in the Twin Cities metro area, as well as in the greater Minnesota, as far north as Hibbing, and down, like I mentioned, the last one that we are hoping that we'll be closing on this fall is in Mankato. I just wanted to, express this because as Raina had mentioned in her presentation, I mean, easements are very flexible and they can be applied to many different types of properties. So we have these big, large commercial buildings in downtowns, down to a farmstead, over to a mid-century modern house, the residential use. So they're definitely very flexible, and they also vary in the actual context of how we became involved in the easement as well. They weren't necessarily all the very straightforward donation, property owner donating to us. We've been involved in many different ways from a number of different sources. So I can talk a little bit about that more in detail later, but I just wanted to give you a brief overview of what types of properties that we have easements on. As for our policies, on the top right, our overall program goal is, we believe that easements are a strong tool to help ensure that our state's historic properties are protected in perpetuity. And from that, we are open to facade and or interior easements, or both facade and interior, as I mentioned in the previous slide. And we also believe that, that this ensures that the future of the property, and it provides more stability to neighborhoods. And as such, too, we also are open to properties regardless of their designation status. So putting an easement on a property that not necessarily has that historic legal protection from a city view or from an HPC. And this carries on from what Raina had mentioned earlier, too, about the flexibility of these agreements and what types of properties they can be added to. In terms of our overall program policies, though, we have a donation process for the easement, which, like I mentioned, there are many ways to acquire an easement, but this is one of our, the main way that I'll just overview is there's a donation application, which carries a fee that we then review, and then upon approval, we start to create some of the baseline documentation. This is very early on in the process of acquiring the easement, but it's more of assessing our ability for the capacity to hold the easement as an organization. And also ensures a little bit of financial help at the beginning so that we can actually go through with some of the baseline documentation and understanding the conditions and what would be protected in an easement at the property. And along with this is where I want to mention our fee structure. We have, as Raina mentioned, there's many different kind of fees structure that you can have. But we have a flat rate for some of our residential properties that we would be open to discussing. It is open to or subject to change based on what the easement actually covers. But we do have a flat rate. I believe the lowest amount I think would be like $2,000 for a simple facade easement on a residential property. But for commercial and larger properties, we do have an endowment model, which is our calculation for how we can successfully monitor and be stewards to the property into the future. We have monitoring policies as well. I'll talk about this in a little bit detail in a later slide, but we have 5-year inspection cycles, as well as reviewing the alterations, which is where the communication is really key with the property owner for reviewing these alterations, and then also the last option, which is the defend through litigation, which is part of our overall program policy. Going off of that, the legal defense fund is what we call our easement fund. This is where all the donation amount goes to. It's specifically set aside to monitoring and being stewards to the property. And then the way that our organization makes a little bit of general operating costs is that we can transfer half of the interest generated from this fund to our general operating expenses. And then lastly, we have some of our policies for what we would do for baseline documentation. This is a very general overview, and it also depends on how we get involved in the property. Sometimes properties owners already have some sort of documentation or historic structures report that we can go off of. But we do have a building condition reform we fill out. We require a site plan and a plat map, as well as property tax data. We also go through the city, county, and state history sources and looking for historic photos and any tax photos we can find. As well as going through a detailed description of the conservation of cultural values. And then if there is a rehabilitation plans, we do require that those be submitted as well. So I just wanted to show some examples of language that we use in our easement. This is taken from our sample easement. On the left is just a very rough outline of what we would include. This obviously can be adjusted depending on the property, but I wanted to highlight a few of these areas which pertain to the historic preservation portion of the easement. And so the first one, the grantor's covenants, the grantor is the property owner, and then Rethos would be the grantee. But the grantor's covenants are what covenants the property owner agrees to when they are putting the easement on the property. The big one is the covenant to maintain, which means that they have to maintain the property in good standing order. But also included in this is as Raina mentioned, the prohibited activities, which is really where there's no you can't destroy the building, raise the building, do certain things to the building. And the language that we use is the following acts or uses are expressly forbidden on, over, or under premises, except as otherwise conditioned. And sometimes we do condition those without prior approval from the grantee, which would be us. And in addition to that, this is where we identify some of the significant protected features of the property. Similar to this, sometimes the covenants and the conditional rights sections have a little bit of overlap, which you'll see in a second with some of the case studies that I have. But for the conditional rights, this is where there are certain rights that the property owner agrees to that are conditioned with, our approval. So the language we use is the without prior express written approval of the grantee, signed by the executive director, which approval may be withheld or conditioned in the sole discretion of grantee. Some of this gets kind of a little bit legal jargony, but this is where we can have certain things that we would just have to approve of in order for the property owner to do. This is also where we outline the review of the grantor's requests for different alterations, as well as highlighting the standards of review. We always use the Secretary of Interior standards for rehabilitation in our review process, which often overlaps with any other historic designation requirements that the property is under, especially if it's going to be a tax credit project or something similar to that. And this is also where the public access component comes in. And as Raina mentioned, this is where this may be dependent on the actual property, but for some of our interior easements, this is important just because there has to be some sort of public access to the interior for that public benefit to exist. And then the grantor's reserved rights. This is the property owner's rights that they have that do not require any involvement from Rethos. And it's obviously subject to the covenants or the conditional rights, but there are certain things that they are outlined in this section that are important to the property owner that they can do without our approval. And then in terms of the actual, perpetuity and preservation in long term, the assignment section is really important. It runs with the land, so the language is this easement shall be effective in perpetuity and shall be deemed to run as binding servitude with the premises. So that's all important to showing how the property will be preserved into the future and be maintained, along with this good standing relationship between the property owner and Rethos. I also want to point out too that some of this language is a little bit scary, and in terms of, so communication is very much key when you're talking with the property owner about the easement. There's a lot of definitely very harsh verbs and verbiage here that definitely can scare off property owners, thinking like they can or can't do certain things. And so I like to, talk about this as more of a guideline to what the project or the property owner can do to their property, and really communicate with them that it's more of this relationship between us and them. It's not necessarily has to be anything more complicated than that. And that we are definitely open to discussing things for the approval and for the best practice at the property. But it's not, it definitely kind of falls into some of the tropes with preservation professionals and kind of the hindering effect that preservation sometimes has on properties, or the perception of that. So I just wanted to point that out as well on this slide. In terms of our monitoring practices, so I mentioned that we have 5-year cycles with our monitoring. And so within those 5 years, there's going to be 4 windshield assessments and 1 professional inspection. And so windshield assessments, you have a little bit of a snippet here with our monitoring package. But essentially, it's just what it sounds like. It's a very broad view, just checking in on the property, documenting with photos, and rating the building components on their condition. The communication for this windshield assessment would be to notify the property owner at least a month in advance before we do the assessment and ensure that if they want to be there, they can be there. And then following up with them after to notice what we find at during the assessment. And this can be done by either staff at Rethos or volunteers, depending on the location. Sometimes it's not as accessible to us as a staff. So we from time to time have engaged volunteers to go through with this, which we make it a very easy process for them to do that with very easy access to some of the protected features and other things included in the easement, so that they can have that reference point when they visit the property. As for the professional inspection, this is something that would come out of our legal defense fund to pay for a professional to check in on the property to assess whether or not there needs to be anything done to it, or what kind of things we need to be looking out for in the future in terms of the conditions of the actual building. And then alterations as they come with, there are definitely different things that come up every once in a while. It depends on what the status of the property is, if it's, undergoing a rehabilitation or some sort of restoration process. We'd definitely like to be aware of that so that we can provide our written approval and document that. And then, to my knowledge, we haven't actually had to defend any of our properties through litigation, but this would be something that would be included in the monitoring section as well, if it gets to that point, which we would definitely explore other options, as many as possible before it does get to that point. I wanted to show a few examples of our easements, the first of which you may be familiar with if you visited St. Paul, the St. Paul building in downtown, just around the corner from our Rethos office at the Landmark Center. This building, so the easement that we have on it is actually only covering the facades on 5th and Wabasha Streets. It is one of our earlier easements, so some of the sections may not necessarily line up with the sample easement that I presented earlier. But I wanted to point out a few things about it. It's pretty straightforward in what is protected with it. We actually don't have any specific features that we highlight in the easement, but they all are kind of compacted into a numbered system that combines the covenant and the conditional rights and reserved rights of the property owner. And sometimes we do qualify that with without written consent, they can't do this, or things like that. So for alterations, without written consent, nothing can be done to affect the appearance or condition of the facades, increase or decrease the height of the building, or adversely affect the structural soundness of the building. And so those are pretty straightforward. There's a maintenance and repair clause, as I mentioned, that's part of our easements. Obstruction of visibility, obviously that there might be some times when restoration is needed for the facade, and there may be scaffolding or things that actually obstruct the visibility. So this is not just a strict, clause of trying to always maintain that sight line from the street, but it has to be without, written consent. Nothing can obstruct the visibility of the facades, which we would obviously allow anything for restoration purposes. The same thing with utility transmission lines. We would have to provide written consent for that as well. And then finally, signs are a big part of our easements too. We have to provide consent for, plaques and other markers, as well as directional and parking signs, and advertisement for commercial or other uses. So like I mentioned, this one's fairly straightforward. It just covers 2 facades of the building. There's no interior component, and it really just kind of lays it out in a bulleted section of the easement of what can or can't be done. The next one is a little bit more detailed, and it's one of the more interesting easements that we have in the state. It's the Polikoff House in Shoreview, Minnesota. It's a mid-century house built in the early 60s and designed by Donovan Wagner, but it's not designated. So this is one that this is the only protection really on the house in terms of the actual designation status or legal protection. But as Raina mentioned earlier in her presentation, there's many different ways that we can acquire an easement, and this one came from property owners who were very interested and loved their house, but wanted to see it and wanted to ensure that it maintained its unique design into the future, as well as the unique property on Snail Lake. And they didn't have any children to leave the property to, so this is one of the only methods that they had to actually protect their property. And as you can see, it's located in a very dense wooded lot. It's kind of overgrown at the moment, but I'll talk a little bit about what that means for the easement. But recently it sold to new owners, and they're planning to go through the restoration process for the property, which I'm excited to see it fully done. But in terms of a residential property that's not designated, we went through the process of acquiring this easement and discussing what types of needs might be there for the property in the future. And so under the prohibited activities, we actually, in conditional rights, we actually kind of have some similar things that kind of have overlaps between these two things. But One of the things that we actually allow, it's kind of misleading with the prohibited activities, but we allow for a one-story garage to be built on the site as long as it's in similar design as the house. We also allow for a small lakeshore attendant structure to be built because it's on the lake, and we recognize that the future owners may want to have some sort of structure there. And then any other buildings or structures on the site that we would have to be approved by us as well. And I'll talk through a little bit some of the protected features in the next slides. But then in terms of, their conditional rights, like if there are anything that they need to do to the building, increase the height of, make additions, change exterior construction materials, stuff like that, we would have to approve it. And then any changes to the building components, any significant restructuring, repair, repainting, any topographical changes, as well as cutting down trees or removing native live trees and shrubs. We would just have to have approval of that for them to do that. Which for this property, I know a lot of, there's some invasive buckthorn in the property that the property owners are planning to go through, and some dead trees that they're trying to get rid of as well. But in terms of just, the very nature of the wooded lot itself, the easement is protecting against, demolishing this house and dividing it up for some new construction or making it into a open lot or anything like that. Which is important to the property owners when they donated the easement to us. In terms of some of the protected features, so there's both interior and exterior elements of the easement, and they're kind of combined into one section here. So this is some of the exterior photos of some of these large single light windows and patios on each side of the house. And so one of the big things that we wrote into this easement is to actually be fairly flexible in the interpretation of this, but still protecting the actual design of the house. So the first point is this visual connection between the interior and exterior through floor-to-ceiling windows on all facades. So that really establishes right away the fenestration protection and making sure that there is this relationship between the interior and exterior, especially with these designs of the patios. And within that, there's a couple smaller bullet points about just the windows in the public areas, as well as when there are different types of windows, like the over the hopper windows in the non-public areas, and then also protecting the patios on both sides of the house as well. And like I said, this language is fairly open to interpretation, and it doesn't necessarily have to be this, preserve outright in place. But this connection and these types of windows are meant to be there in perpetuity. There's also a clause about the grid-based proportions of the rooms, openings, and wall finishes, which kind of makes more of the protecting the interior against completely removing all interior walls or doing any drastic changes to that, or making some weird proportions of rooms. Like I said, this is also very open to interpretation as well. And then some of the other interior slides here, I'll continue on with the last clause, which is the simplicity of materials as a part of this easement. Which particularly makes the point to say the preservation of certain materials within the house need to be maintained and cannot be changed. Particularly the unpainted gray brick on the interior and exterior, as well as plastered ceilings and soffits without moldings or trim on both the ceiling and the floor. Some of the different flooring types, like slate, linoleum, and wood flooring, and then uniform mosaic tile in the bathrooms. So, I mean, this is also open to interpretation as well. There's not necessarily any, color definitions except for the gray brick and some of the unique features of slate and wood. But other than that, there's still some openness to how the future property owners can actually use the house and what they can do to the house. And with that, I believe I am wrapping up here. Thank you all for taking the time to listen to both me and Raina today. I believe we're going to be open for questions. But if you have any other further inquiries about our program, here's my contact information. You can reach me via my cell phone number now, since we're all working from home, or email ethan@rethos.org. But yeah, I believe we are all done and open for questions.
Rena and Ethan, this is Michael again. I'm not seeing questions, but I think John is monitoring that. So I don't know if there have been any submitted. I was going to ask if, and this would be directed to both of you, are you aware of any easements that contain provisions regarding archaeological sites and features? And I'm guessing Rena can reference something that she's familiar with that the trust is involved with, but I'm really curious, Ethan, if you're aware of anything in Minnesota.
I can go first. Yes, Michael, some of our easements do protect archaeological resources. We actually do have an easement on a National Historic Landmark archaeology site. And so that's kind of an outlier, but we do have properties where as through the kind of development of the site, we knew there had been sites pre-known prior to our engagement. And so as part of the due diligence process, we actually did a phase 1 to identify what those sites would be and then protect them in the easement agreement themselves. So that's something we do kind of as needed. And I know there are in the Southwest, there's, I'm blanking the name, I think it's the Archaeological Conservancy. They actually hold easements on archaeological sites in the Southwest. So they're an organization that's founded for that very purpose.
Yeah, I will admit that my knowledge of easements is fairly limited to our program, and because we don't hold any archaeological sites or have any provisions for any archaeological material or parts of our easements, I can't necessarily speak to the Minnesota statewide, but I'd be curious if there are any attendees in the chat that know of any too.
You took the words out of my mouth, Ethan. I was hoping that people would take that as an opportunity to weigh in as well, but I don't know if folks have.
Let's see. I'm looking at the other questions, trying to at least. Regarding, someone asked about easement being extinguished, perhaps as a result, as through eminent domain. Certainly that is something that we, at the National Trust, we've never had one of our easements extinguish, either partial or full extinguishment. But that is something that does come up in the conservation world quite a bit. And there is some best practices out there on how to proceed in that. Extinguishment is obviously something that is typically done through a judicial process. So you have to get a court order in order for the easement to be extinguished. And in some states, it's actually even more restrictive than that. So yes, that has happened. I can't give a specific example at the top of my head, but eminent domain has been a reason in the past. Let's see.
It looks like there's a question about appraisers. Raina, I know we discussed this as a possibility. I don't know if you want to take that one. How do appraisers determine the reduced value of a property due to an easement?
Yeah, and happy to do that. Regarding appraisers and appraisals, trying to see if I can actually see the question to make sure I can answer it. But there is something called the Appraisal Institute, which has a list of persons who are qualified appraisers for historic preservation easements specifically. And those are people that understand how to do appraisals for those tax motivated easements that I discussed under the 170H code. And so generally speaking, you want to really, if you're going to pursue a transaction like that, you really want to vet a appraiser, potential appraiser. This isn't going to be your typical, home appraisal for a mortgage. It's definitely a very complex type of appraisal for conservation and preservation easements. And so There are persons out there who are qualified, who are trained in this. And so it's something that if that's something you want to pursue, there are, I will say they're not many out there. So you may have to look at someone even from somewhere like Chicago. There's a firm out of Philadelphia, for example, that does a lot of work up and down the East Coast. So yeah, I'm trying to think. Oh, here we go. Oh, I see the question now. Sorry. Thank you. It depends. Someone asked, who is the holder of the IRS 170H easement? And you mentioned the determining before and after. Do you find there's a significant decrease in value when easements are placed on properties? It depends. It depends on how it really, once again, since easements are extremely flexible, the appraised amount, how much the easement is restricting the value really can vary. If you Google about this, I will say there has been a lot of abuses and a lot of IRS scrutiny on this topic, appraisal specifically. And in the recent past, there's been some bad actors that have really taken advantage of the system, and there's some efforts to make some reforms to kind of decrease those abuses. But the appraisal value itself, it can really depend. If you're talking about a 700-acre forested land that you're going to restrict subdivision or forestry, I mean, that could significantly decrease the potential value of the property. But a modest residential house in a historic district may have a less. It's hard to say, since each property is so different. The appraised value typically will be just depending on how restricted those restrictions are. I hope that was helpful.
Ethan, it looked like there's a question for you regarding the easement on the Veblen farmstead.
Yeah, I was just looking that up here. So I don't believe it's owned by a nonprofit. I believe it's owned by a private individual. I would have to double check on that. I haven't actually been down to the property yet since I haven't been in this position extreme long time. But according to our records, it's owned by a private individual.
I would agree with you. I think you're correct about that. I mean, I also haven't been down to the farm in quite a number of years, but a long time ago when our office was much more involved in the preservation and restoration of the Veblen farmstead, we did work directly with the owner, and I presume he either still owns it privately or has passed it on to a different family member. I'm not certain about that, but I presume that's the case. Did either of you see other questions pop up?
I did see there was an earlier question about a relationship between SHPO and Rethos. And speaking about easements, one of the recent easements that was part of a Section 106 requirement, we did have to have the SHPO review the easement to determine that Section 106 as a part of that. So I wanted to address that one too.
Any other questions?
I'll throw one last one out, maybe with the minute or two we have left. And you might have already touched on this, Raina or Ethan, I can't recall. So if a property is locally designated already through a local preservation ordinance, is it really necessary or essential to look at having an easement, or is that considered really overkill, I guess?
The long story short is it depends on the preservation goals for the property. We have many easements on properties that are also locally regulated, and the reasons for those owners choosing to do them were varied. And we just did one. Our most recent easement is one of those from March, and part of the reason why we accepted that one specifically is that we also did interior protections, and in many cases, local preservation ordinances don't do interior protections. They only do facades visible from a right of way, and some do interiors, but they normally have to be public spaces. So there may be additional restrictions. In some municipalities, the local, if you feel that there's potential that the ordinance could be undone or weakened, the preservation easement could be stricter. So the answer is, if it's a National Historic Landmark or a really significant property, maybe it makes sense to have both. But you really have to just determine what makes sense for the property, I think.
Yeah, I'd also add that, if there's the donation process involved and the tax benefit, like you don't necessarily get the tax benefit if you're a locally listed building, but if you donate your easement, there is that added incentive for the property owner to continue maintaining and preserving the building.
Yeah, good point. Thank you both. It looks like there was one other question that popped up a second ago. Can a future owner have a property delisted from the easement program?
That goes back to I was using the word extinguishment. And so that's when, easements are recorded in the land records permanently, on the title of a property. And so the only way to remove that easement is something through the extinguishment process. So you're actually doing a full extinguishment, which is removing all the restriction, or partial extinguishment in some cases. And once again, that's that, potential judicial process I mentioned. So we get this question a lot from people, specifically people who are buying new easement properties. And we always say we've never done an extinguishment in the almost 50 years of our program. And so it's not something that we would take lightly, and we would do unless it was absolutely necessary.
We get asked the same question about the National Register program as well. Ethan, it looks like someone, I'm not sure if you saw this, appears to be regarding Mill City Museum, the terms and scope of Rethos's easement on the Mill City Museum.
Yeah, so I can't speak much to the context of why the easement was created in the first place, because I believe that was one from early, I think it was 2002. But in terms of the scope, it's just merely a facade easement on the 2nd Street facade. So we just cover, it's fairly straightforward, similar to the one that I presented on the presentation, the St. Paul building, just ensuring that there's a maintenance for, clause, as well as obstruction and things like that require our written consent for. But it's only on the 2nd Street facade, facing away from the river.
Okay, thanks. I don't see any other questions. I don't know if either of you do. And John has been forwarding the ones that are coming in, and I haven't seen one pop up. So we may be done, and we're a few minutes over our appointed hour, which is fine. We filled the time perfectly. So I just want to extend my thanks to both of our presenters, Raina and Ethan. Really great information. Just a reminder that the presentation was recorded, as will be all of the additional presentations. So you'll be able to go to our SHPO website in the future to look at those again. And with that, I'll just throw out a reminder that for this Thursday, we'll have another session at 10 a.m. on collaborative planning for Indian mounds and indigenous burial ground. Really interesting project that the city of St. Paul was involved with. So I hope people will be able to participate in that as well. So with that, thank you again, Raina and Ethan. Appreciate your time greatly. And I hope everyone has a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.